Okay, folks, you're live.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday afternoon. I'm Prateek Waghre. I just started earlier this month as IFF's policy director. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with us, the Internet Freedom Foundation, we're a digital liberties organization, and our goal is to ensure that citizens can use the internet with the liberties guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. Now, to support our work, we also have a fundraiser going on. So if you're not already a member or a supporter, we encourage you to participate. If you already are, then the entire team at IFF here would really appreciate it if you can spread the word, get your friends, etc., to support us as well. Right now, what we're here today, in today's briefing, we're here to talk about the recent directions that the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT-In, issued on April 28th, and our main concerns, which are to do with the lack of open and transparent public consultation, ambiguity with many of the directions that were issued, and I think crucially the potential for penal provisions. And to go over this today, I'm joined by my colleague Tejasi Panjiar, who's a capstone fellow at IFF, and Srinvas Kodali, who many of you may be familiar with, but I'll introduce him nevertheless. Srinvas is an interdisciplinary researcher working with the Free Software Movement of India. He advocates for digital rights, privacy, cybersecurity, transparency, and accountability of India's digital infrastructure. So we're trying something new. If you were on for one of our last briefings, the way we're going to do this today is that Tejasi and I will walk through the directions, what each of them say, what our concerns are, and where possible, what the response has been. And just to, some of you may have already seen this, but a couple of hours before this call, we also put out a set of FAQs that were being circulated. While we're still analyzing that and going through it in a little bit of detail, where it makes sense, we'll try to introduce that. If there was any clarification to the concern that we raised during it, and then we'll toward the end we'll also ask Srinivas to address some meta points about the whole consultation and the whole set of directions. And at around the 35 to 40-minute mark, depending on how we're doing on time, we'll stop the public live stream and we'll head into members-only discussion, where we'll be following the Chatham House rule. So with that, we can start. And Tejasi, I think you can take over, and then we'll alternate as we go along.
Thank you, Prateek. Before we start the presentation, I'd once again like to thank everyone for joining in today. So a little introduction about the directions, although Prateek has already covered it a little bit. So on April 28th this year, the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT-In, issued fresh directions under Section 70B of the Information Technology Act, or the IT Act. Now, what is CERT-In? CERT-In is the national nodal agency that responds to computer security incidents as and when they occur in the country. The stated reason behind introducing these directions was to facilitate and improve response activities as well as emergency measures with respect to rising cybersecurity incidents. Now, the directions dated April 28th will become effective in 60 days after its release. Before we move ahead, we would once again like to acknowledge that an FAQ document was recently circulated by CERT-In with respect to these directions. Although the document is yet to be made public, we have, just a few hours ago, released the document on Twitter to encourage transparency and public engagement. We've also accompanied the document with an initial analysis of the FAQs, which will be followed by a more in-depth analysis of the FAQ documents in the coming days. Now, due to the increasing data breaches and cyber attacks, directions aimed at strengthening the cybersecurity posture of this country is the need of the hour. But as many cybersecurity researchers have already pointed out, these directions fail to fulfill that need. Before we go into direction by direction in-depth analysis, I will walk you through some of the broad overall concerns. Firstly, and most importantly, these directions were issued without any public consultation with technology and cybersecurity experts, as well as civil society organizations. This has led to the directions having a very narrow view, ultimately failing to safeguard the digital rights of users. Now, although the FAQ document does say that the consultation with industry, government, and other stakeholders were held, it clarifies that this was based on consultation done and input received from time to time, which means that most probably a public consultation was not held specifically for these directions. Next, there is a lot of ambiguity in the scope and phrasing of directions, which may result in a lot of confusion. CERT-In has failed to define in the main document multiple terms such as data centers, service providers, intermediaries, body corporates, etc. Now, it's worth noting here that the subsequent FAQ document, which was circulated, has defined these terms, which were initially left undefined. This, to some extent, has reduced the ambiguity. The recent directions contain no directions mandating disclosures for users who are actual victims of a cyber attack or a data breach. So, in the absence of a legal obligation on data fiduciaries to inform the users in case of a data breach, the end user will be unable to mitigate privacy-related harms. Additionally, there is no clarity on the processes and grievance-related mechanisms in place after an incident has been reported to CERT-In. These gaps in the direction lead to serious lack of transparency and accountability. Next, we know that digital security researchers and vulnerability testers are important stakeholders in the cybersecurity arena. But instead of encouraging, promoting, and protecting Indian security researchers, they have usually faced hostility. CERT-In once again fails to recognize their potential in improving the cybersecurity posture of the country and doesn't provide them with any protections under these directions. Now, as mentioned earlier, these directions are issued under Section 70B of the IT Act. This means that failure to furnish information as requested by CERT-In or non-compliance with directions may invite punitive action under subsection 7 of the Section 70B of the IT Act, as well as other laws as applicable. Lastly, and we cannot emphasize on this enough, these directions are released in the absence of a data protection bill. So without a data protection framework in place, primarily to protect against possible misuse of these overly broad provisions, such requirements have the potential to enable mass surveillance and other privacy-related harms. We will now analyze each direction to help you understand how these concerns arise and what consequences they may have. Over to you, Prateek.
Thanks. So direction 1 is up on the screen there now. And effectively it's an instruction to service providers to synchronize their clocks with NTP or network time protocol servers of the NIC, which is the National Informatics Center, and the NPL, the National Physical Laboratory, right? Or servers that are traceable to them. Now, from an incident response perspective, recommending that clocks are synchronized, that there is value in that. But there were questions, as soon as these actions released, there were questions around discoverability and reliability that were raised by researchers on Twitter. And the IFF team actually curated a Twitter moment, so you can go look that up. There are a couple of tweets in there. There were question marks of would they have the capacity and to handle the kind of load that may come in, and as well as what it means for organizations with with large infrastructure spanning multiple geographies. Are they expected to synchronize to these servers as well, right? Now, some of these have been addressed in the FAQ in the FAQ documents that have come out, but there still seems to be some room for some amount of ambiguity there, right? And again, goes back to the point that I think we'll make repeatedly, is that some of this would have been addressed with an open public consultation process. Over to you, Dipsi.
Thank you, Prateek. So direction 2 is now on your screen. So with this direction, CERT-In has taken a very one-size-fits-all approach. So if you read the first statement, you will notice that CERT-In has instructed all entities to mandatorily report cyber incidents to CERT-In within 6 hours of either noticing such incidents or being brought to notice about such incidents. So here there is no categorization for reporting requirement, which takes into account the type or size of entities affected, their capacity to respond, the severity of the incident, and the scale of the impact. So like for instance, Singapore cybersecurity guidelines instruct critical information infrastructure or CII to report an incident within 2 hours and other entities to report similar incidents within 72 hours. CERT-In, on the other hand, has failed to specify reasonable reporting timeframes and placed insurmountable pressure on entities by mandating an overambitious timeframe of just 6 hours. In such a situation where crucial decisions are to be made, such a short time frame is nearly not enough, especially when you compare it to the global standards of 72 hours. Now here it is worth noting that in the recently circulated FAQs, it is clarified that entities may provide information to the extent available at the time of reporting, and that additional information may be reported later within reasonable time to CERT-In. While clarity may provide some relief, there is still no explanation behind this overambitious and unrealistic time frame. Back to you, Prateek.
Thanks. Now, direction 3 essentially calls for so that CERT-In being able to mandate that that organizations need to provide assistance or information in response to an order. Notably, it asks for information to be provided in code in up to and near real time. Right. It requires the designation of a point of contact, and if this information isn't supplied, you'll see the part that's highlighted there on the left. It says it would be treated as non-compliance of this direction, right? And this is a point that Tejasi raised earlier as well. That elsewhere it states that the failure to furnish information on non-compliance would invite punitive action under Section 7 of Section 70. Subsection 7 of Section 70B of the IT Act. And I have that pasted there at the bottom, which also basically says that it is punishable with imprisonment for a term that may extend up to 1 year, or a fine of 1 lakh rupees, or both. Right? And this is again goes back to the point here that when there are penal provisions, at stake, then the ambiguity that was there in the initial, in the direction itself, they take on an added level of significance, right? Because it is unclear how organizations can comply, should comply, etc. And it just creates that level of pressure that Tejasi was talking about. Back to you, Tejasi.
So to clearly understand the concerns here, we will break direction 4 into 3 parts. So if you read the first highlighted section, CERT-In instructs the mentioned entities to mandatorily enable logs of all their ICT systems. So ambiguity over what is covered under all their ICT systems leads to various concerns, such as government having access to or enterprises storing more data than necessary. In the absence of clarity over such a phrase, internationally recognized principles of purpose limitation and data minimization may not be followed. As you can see in the screenshot below, the FAQs elaborate on the types of logs that must be maintained. This list, though helpful to some extent, is not exhaustive and aims to give only a rough idea of the types of logs to be maintained by various entities. So the next highlighted section place data collection and retention requirements on various entities. Concerns around collecting and storing data beyond purpose or need are exacerbated through the requirements of mandatorily maintaining logs securely for a rolling period of 180 days. Now, this part is important. Such requirements go against internationally recognized principles of storage limitation related to processing of data. The ambiguity around the time frame of 180 days, along with the lack of reasoning behind it, could lead to serious privacy violations. Further, there are certain service providers such as Signal, as well as VPNs such as Proton, which claim to not retain any logs due to their privacy respecting practices. So if and when these directions are implemented, service providers may be forced to exit the Indian market as a result of these burdensome requirements. Now, through the last highlighted section, CERT-In puts soft data localization requirements on the mentioned entities, wherein basically a copy of the data must be stored in India. This is a cause of concern as data localization can stifle innovation and the free flow of data across borders. Moreover, added compliance cost would disincentivize foreign companies from bringing their services and products to India. This could result in Indian users not being able to access these services. Thus, the data collections and retention, as well as localization requirements in this direction, raise severe concerns of state-sponsored mass surveillance.
Now, Direction 5 was the one that got the most amount of press attention as well, right? And it essentially calls for different classes of service providers, data centers, virtual private server providers, cloud service providers, and crucially, VPN or virtual private networks of service providers to store certain types of information for a period of 5 years or longer, right? As mandated by an applicable law, after cancellation or withdrawal of the registration, right? So this is come across as as an excessive data retention requirement. Now, the type of information that's demanded itself, right, is includes things like a validated name, the period of hire, IPs allotted to or being used by the members. Now, some of these, drawing on my own past experience from working with a content delivery network, some of these do make sense in the cloud service provider perspective, but from a VPN provider perspective, there is a question of what do you mean by IPs being used by the members, right? And then there's email address and IP address and the timestamp at the time of registration or onboarding. The purpose for hiring services, again, validated addresses and contact numbers, and ownership pattern. Now, ownership pattern was again one where there were a lot of questions over what exactly was meant. This was addressed in the FAQ, and it seems to imply whether what type of corporation it is or whether it's an individual subscriber. That's what it seems to mean. But like I said, this was the one that got a lot of attention. There was a lot of reaction to it. VPN providers, while still unsure of how to respond, and I think we'll see that play out closer to the end of June with 60 days end and these rules become applicable. They did say that, and there's a quote there where one of them said that the rules are worse than countries like China and Russia. There were questions being raised from questions being asked of CERT-In, and incidentally, on the response front, I think there were some quotes where CERT-In taken the position that this is being done to check financial fraud, and again, from coming back to the FAQs, there was the point that corporate VPNs don't need to maintain the logs of customers, right? And this is interesting because there's some history here as well, right? When you talk about VPN specifically. So if you go back to March 2021, there was a parliamentary committee. The Parliamentary Committee on Home Affairs had a report on the atrocities against women and children, and they raised concerns about VPN usage in that. And one of the things that they wanted was, in quotes, a coordination mechanism with international agencies to essentially to block them. And follow up later in the year, I think sometime in August, the committee was unsatisfied with Modi's response, which essentially said that blocking of VPNs could be carried out in response to a court order or the recommendation of an interministerial committee. And if in Feb 2022, Media Nama had reported on that the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, they provided a problem statement for the Smart India Hackathon 2022, and that referred to the need for a solution that can trace IP address of VPN users. So there is an interesting question here in terms of what the government position is with regard to VPNs, and that's an area of concern. And again, going back to the fact that if it's just corporate VPNs that don't need to maintain logs, it's the commercial VPNs that still come under the ambit of this rule that that doesn't do much to allay our fears of this being a potentially privacy invasive service for people who use VPNs in a certain way.
Finally, in the last direction, we notice inclusion of unwarranted provisions, such as mandating the retention of know your customer or KYC authentication information for virtual asset service providers. Now, this particular direction is incongruent with the IT Act of 2000, as it doesn't fall under the ambit of Section 70B. Furthermore, the inclusion of virtual asset service providers, which includes like cryptocurrency exchanges, under the ambit of this direction seems very out of place. The FAQs provide some level of explanation for this addition, stating that emerging technologies have given rise to new cybersecurity challenges, and considering its increasing adoption by businesses, thereby increasing their dependency on cyberspace, increasing attack surface, and thus evolving threat landscape, it is important to address it by adopting reasonable security practices. Nonetheless, this particular provision has so far not attracted much attention, and there hasn't been much media coverage or industry response. Back to you, Prateek.
Thanks. So the directions also included an annexure there which listed the types of incidents that need to be reported. Now, and again, some of this has changed with the FAQs that have been issued. So in principle, I think having an indicative list is not by itself a bad thing, but it didn't help that it came out without clear definitions of each of them and what was required in each case. And again, this goes back to the point of when this is accompanied by penal provision, then precision is required, right? For companies to know when and how to comply. I think that's required. Now, even with the FAQ that have some explanatory lines, there are still questions that are there. So, for example, if you look at item 16 there, which is fake mobile apps, right? Now, it's interesting because who's the question of the responsibility of determining of finding whether there is a fake mobile app, that's still unclear. Because if it's a fake app, it's unlikely to be an intrusion as such, right? So there are still question marks from my perspective. Srinivas, I don't know if you think differently, but there is there could be more clarity there. And I'm repeating this point again and again about the penal provision because I think it's important that there needs to be precision when that burden is being added, right, with these directions.
So finally, coming to our demand, which has been pretty simple since the release of these directions. We call on CERT-In to recall these directions and hold fresh public consultation. We hope that CERT-In considers our recommendations and continues to fight cybersecurity failures in India with the right intent. With that, our presentation has come to an end. For those of you who joined us and are still with us, thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed this analysis, please consider becoming a member today and gaining special privileges for more such calls. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Srinvas. Sir, a lot has been said about these directions by the media, by the industry, cybersecurity researchers, as well as civil society. The recently circulated FAQs state that these directions have been issued to augment and strengthen the cybersecurity posture to ensure an open, safe, trusted, and accountable internet in the country. What, in your opinion, has been the primary motive behind releasing these directions? And in general, what is your analysis of these directions?
I think there has been a lot of pressure on CERT with the recent large-scale data breaches that were being reported across India. I mean, if you take breaches like MobiKwik, Big Basket, and Domino's, right? So there were huge, large-scale data breaches. All of these companies, most of these companies denied there was a breach. People were like, where are the authorities? What are they even doing, right? Like nobody even responded to it. the organization I work with, Free Software Movement of India, we send representations to CERT actually demanding that they look into it because it's part of their mandate. The whole reason this body exists is to look into cybersecurity breaches. And in this case, clearly there were breaches. Now, CERT never really replied. We really don't know if they acted on anything. When it comes to cybersecurity, everything is behind the scenes, right? So it's bots and ransomware and viruses, which it's a dark market. You don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And it's actually the responsibility of chief security officers, chief information security officers, and CERT to work in tandem to ensure that both customers' privacy as well as India's cybersecurity is maintained. Now, most of this work was outsourced. Like CERT never really provides real-time assistance to any cyber emergencies. They are actually, what they do is they empanel cybersecurity companies, and they do this in the name of CERT, right? So now all of this self-regulation kind of framework where companies would get audited by these empaneled companies has really not worked out, and it has resulted in large-scale issues. I think there's a lot of pressure on CERT to do something on their own and not to rely on these external empaneled entities solely. I think CERT is slowly increasing its capacity, its internal capacity to respond to these incidents as well. These rules are in that direction, but the way the rules have been framed to essentially find out every potential attempt, not even a breach, every potential attempt to get into their servers. I mean, even probes, port scans need to be reported to CERT. CERT will be just bombarded in a lot of noise. They won't know where to go and what to act to. Yeah, so at large, there is a lot of pressure on CERT, and they really don't know what they're doing.
Thank you for that. And this is also interesting. You talked about outsourcing their functions, and there are also state level certs, but somehow there is no clarity on after reporting the incident to CERT, whether CERT will direct states to take on these incidents, or there's no clarity on what steps or processes this CERT will take up after these incidents are reported.
Okay. For a long time, I've been trying to report incidents to CERT. Most of them were data breaches and leaks, and not something too complicated, but something which was pretty visible for someone to verify. If you go to CERT's website, they have a directions on how to inform them about vulnerability disclosure, how to send them an email. They even have their GPG keys, so that if you want to send an encrypted email, hide your who you are, but send them these details. But CERT never responds back to you. Like for the longest time, nobody knew if CERT even existed. Off late, like when the whole right to privacy debate was raging, I think CERT kind of was forced to also act and acknowledge some of these vulnerability reports. So they would just allot you a number, like, yes, giving you an acknowledgement saying, yes, we have received your response. Yes, we have received your vulnerability report, and we'll respond to you eventually. Now, when and how and what they will do is completely unknown. CERT operates in dark. There is no transparency on what they do. I mean, matters of cybersecurity, so because security, they can say that we do need a little bit of, how do I put it? They do need a little bit of secrecy on how they operate, and not everything needs to be public by design. But what they do and how they do is never clear. According to their documents, I believe they will respond to you back within 72 hours. But there are so many incidents where cybersecurity researchers were like, oh, we have been waiting for CERT to fix this for a month, right? So if you go talk to people in the community about their experiences with CERT, you will receive a lot of inaction. because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the budget, they don't have the people to act on these issues. So after you report an incident, you never know what CERT is going to do unless you kind of work with a lot of people in the civil society and in the media to put pressure on CERT. Like you send a journalist who's asking some questions about this breach, then CERT will suddenly realize it was supposed to act on it and fix it. So it's like your everyday day-to-day governance in India. You have to exert some pressure, otherwise they won't do anything about it. Now, with these rules, I think CERT intends to actually respond to a lot of them, but I'm not sure. Like you saw an exhaustive list of types of cybersecurity incidents, right? To what incidents will CERT respond, and to which ones they want, which ones they will classify as something that's not worthy of CERT's time to investigate. And when you're talking about a country with so many digital transactions, so billions of digital transactions and millions of complaints, you won't know which ones to go after. And CERT is just asking to be bombarded with information which it can't analyze.
All right. Thanks, Srinvas. So we're about the time where we close the live stream, but I just want to check maybe if there are any questions that have come in on one of the channels. That's fine. Otherwise, we can close the live stream for now.
No questions on the stream.
All right. Then I want to thank everyone for joining us on the live stream.
If I may add one last thing, I think the clarifications on the part of clarifications, there are a lot of media reports where they're saying these rules only apply to VPN service providers who are providing services and not to corporate VPNs. I think that interpretation is wrong, because Direction 4 actually requires every company, every cloud provider to keep logging. And most of the times what Indians do is just take a cloud instance and set up an open VPN. You don't have to buy VPN services from a third party. You can set up your own VPN services. Now, but cloud providers are still required to keep logging IP addresses and their phone numbers, do all the KYC, and keep the logs for 180 days. So this also applies to corporate companies for their VPNs if there are insider attacks, right? Like companies do track them on their own, where they're trying to see who inside the company is accessing what, and in case of there is a potential data theft, they actually go and look into it. Now, this idea that these rules don't apply to corporate VPNs is somehow not what the rules kind of say. Like Direction 5 is only for VPN companies, but Direction 4 still applies to corporate VPNs, and they are expected to keep logs and share it with CERT whenever they demand it.
No, yes, I think I agree with you. And that was our interpretation as well when we put it out, that it's Direction 5 that seems to, that the clarification seems to be for. Direction 4 still, as you pointed out, seems to apply to everyone, right? In its broad language. So yes, I think that's a good point, and thank you for bringing that up and clarifying it. All right. So as I was saying, thank you to everyone for joining us. As I also mentioned when we started, we do have a fundraiser going on. So if you to enable us to support our work, to enable us to do what we do consider contributing. And if you already are, then like I said, please ask your family and friends to support us as well. Thank you very much.